All right, guys, welcome back to the channel. So today we are going to do the first in, we'll call it a multi-part video series around tuning for boost. So this was kind of the next most requested thing from you guys, and this one we're going to have to break into a few topics. It's going to be lengthy, and I apologize for the length of the first video around the limits of the EEC-IV. So what we're going to do here is we're going to go through an exercise where we start with a bone stock A9L 5-speed EFI Fox configuration, and we're going to do what we would need to do to tune it for a Vortech Supercharged 347 combo. And so this first video, what we're going to cover is the fueling side of things. We're going to start with the base tune. We're going to get just the basic information we need to get our mass air transfer in there and get all of our fuel injector settings in there. And we're going to focus on the first side of scaling load, which is going to be how we scale our fuel tables so that we can go beyond 100 load. And this will all make more sense when we get into it. Now, the very first thing that I would recommend you do, though, I mean, if you think about a supercharged combo, you know, what are you changing when you're doing this? So you've just probably changed a bunch of your fuel system. You just added the blower. You've probably just changed your mass air to go along with that. Hell, you may have even just done a cam and some other things too. So what I encourage people to do when they can is run your combo without the blower first, because the blower at least is an easy bolt-on thing. A turbo is a little more involved. You know, you're really kind of redoing a lot more than that. But when you're dealing with a blower, if you can get your combo running and healthy first and do some basic logging with the injectors you plan to use and the mass air that you're going to use, I'd encourage you to kind of baseline it and get it healthy and happy there first. Then we go in, add the blower to it, and then make some changes in the tune from there. And there's one very specific setting that you cannot check and know how to tune properly once you've added the boost. So if you've already thrown the blower on and you don't have a baseline to work from, that's okay too. At least it's easy with blowers. You just take the belt off. The car will still run without it. It'll be choked out a little bit, so you're not going to get all the power you normally would, but you know, but it'll still run just fine, even though there's kind of that extra restriction in the blower that's not actually turning. The car still works. So here's where we're going to start with this whole thing. So on this sheet right here, this is a Ford Racing 80-pound injector calibration sheet. And anytime you go get a set of injectors, you really need to understand what the settings are for the injectors when you get started. And so even if they don't maybe come with it in the box, you can usually do some research for the common injectors online, and you can dig up a calibration sheet like this. If you don't have this, you know, you can kind of figure out what all these settings are with some testing, but there are definitely some more advanced techniques to really get this stuff dialed in, and it's a headache. And the other thing you need to understand is, you know, when you talk to a tuner and you're saying, hey, I want you to tune my car, they're going to ask you a bunch of specs on the build. Of course, they're going to ask you injectors. And if you just tell them the pound size of the injector, that doesn't really help. You know, all 24-pound injectors are not created equal. All 30-pound are not created equal. And a good example of that, if real quick, if I jump over to Efi Dyno Tuning, the guys that put this website together, they actually have a bunch of common injectors that they see out here with basically some documented known good data. And so when we get down in here, into the 24-pound, you can see there's quite a few different injectors that they have data for, and specifically a couple injectors I've pulled up that are at 39 PSI. So they're technically both 24-pound injectors, and they're both at 39.15 PSI, which is what your computer would run stock. But you'll see how different some of the settings are. So we're going to look at these injectors versus these LU24As. So when you look at this, we start with the low slope, the high slope, and the break point. And from the last video, if you remember, what we talked about is the high slope is sort of the equivalent of generally how the injector is rated. So if it's a 24-pound injector, you'd expect the high slope at that rated pressure to be pretty close to 24, and the low slope is some amount larger. So if you look at these two injectors, the high slopes are pretty close, 2331, 2383. It's a little different, but not too much. But 26 and 29, I mean, that's a pretty substantial amount of fueling difference. You're looking at, you know, over a 10% difference there. So, you know, this is just an example of what I mean when I say all injectors are not really created equal. I've even seen guys do crazy stuff like, you know, they'll have their combo together, one of their injectors is leaking, and they're like, oh, I've got a bad injector. And rather than replacing the whole set or even replacing the one bad injector with one that's identical to it, they'll go to the junkyard, they'll go grab something they know is a 24-pound, but it's not the same injector, that's a big no-no. Don't ever do that. You need to have a matching set, if nothing else. And definitely, if you can, something that you can get known good injector data for. Otherwise, especially as a new tuner and kind of doing this yourself, you're going to jump through a bunch of extra hoops unnecessarily. So this was just kind of for reference, but just know that you can go in here and a lot of the common stuff that's out there you can find, and if you go dig online, you can find some more. So these injectors that we're going to simulate here, these are some 80-pound injectors. And if you remember from the last video too, I said that there's a limitation in the EEC-IV where it will not let you put in injector slopes over a certain size, which is 112.5 pounds. Now you're going to see that we get very close to that, and that's why when you go bigger than 80, you got to jump through some hoops, and I don't want to get into that yet. So this is what we're going to start with. So on the injector data, these are really the first three numbers we're going to put in. So this is the low slope, the high slope, the break point. And you're going to have to do some conversion math on this, on all three of these actually. So we're going to start with the low slope and high slope. So jumping over to binary editor, we're going to go into fuel. And again, right now, this is a base A9L tune. I've not changed anything yet. So just keep in mind that's what we're starting with. So I'm going to go into fuel, and under injector here, we've got the high slope and the low slope. Now, this measurement is pounds per second. But if you look at what we're actually putting in here, this is pounds per hour. So the math that you're going to need to do is to take these numbers and multiply them by 60 and then multiply them by 60 again, because there are 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour. So that's how you would ultimately turn this number into a pounds per hour, or you can multiply by 3,600. You can get there a little quicker. So I'm just going to open up the calculator, and we will do 0.028183 times 3,600, and we get 101.458. So that's going to be our low slope. So we'll go plug that in. We're on low slope, and 101.458. Okay, so that's our low slope. And then we're going to do the same math for the high slope. So pulling up my calculator here, this is 0.020877 times 3,600. And we get to 75.15. And again, just because it's rated at 80 doesn't mean that's right. I'm going to double check that just to make sure I didn't fat finger that, but 0.020877 times 3,600, 75.15. So this is what we're going to put in for our high slope. Okay, let's got the high slope, we've got the low slope. Now, the next thing we have to do is we want to put in the break point. And the break point is basically telling you at what point in fuel flow are we transitioning from low slope to high slope. Because again, the fueling characteristics, when you're not asking the injector to do much, the injector behaves a lot differently than it will later. So we need to plug in this point. And this needs to be pretty accurate too, or else your mid-range is going to have a little funkiness to it. It'll get a little choppy in there. Sometimes you won't really notice it because a lot of times you're making that transition pretty quick. You lean into the pedal, your load spikes up, and you're going to go, way into the high slope pretty quick. But there's kind of a mid-range there that if you're riding in that area, it can be a little weird sometimes, and you're going to try to mess with your math curve to try to fix that. But really, it's just the fact that your break point's off. Now, these break points, a lot of times when you see these sheets, you'll see them as like a decimal where it's point, and then you'll see a whole bunch of zeros, and then ultimately a number. Now, when you go into binary editor and look at how this data is stored here, this is actually using scientific notation times 10 to the negative fifth. And so just to get into the math here, I pulled this up, but this is what scientific notation really means. And this is kind of what we're looking at here. So when you see something times 10 to the negative fifth, you're really saying, I have to move the decimal place over this many positions to go from one to the other. So what they're expecting here, and you can kind of use this as your point of reference, 3.03. If I consider that the other way around, I'd actually shift the decimal over, so it'd be 0.000030398. So basically what we're going to have to do here is going back to the calibration sheet that we're looking at, we're going to take this number and shift it over 5 decimal places, which would end up being 2.421. So 2.421, and that's our number, and then I'm going to copy that same number into all these cells. And so that's going to be our break point. Okay, so we've got low slope, high slope, break point. Those are the kind of the three first things. Now, the next thing we have to do is we have a table here where we are dealing with our voltage offset. So going back in here, you have this injector offset versus battery voltage table. And basically what you're saying is that, your car is constantly changing voltages, different RPMs, your alternator kind of going up and down, you're never staying at a perfectly steady voltage. So theoretically, you never go above about 16 volts. Most cars are really never going to get down below about 13, and they generally hover somewhere in the 14 to 15 range. But again, as your voltage drops, like when your AC kicks on as an example, you kind of have that quick spike, the compressor kicks on. If you've got electric fans, they're going to kick on at the same time. That puts a lot of load on your charging system. So you can see these sort of temporary drops in voltage. And if this table's not dialed in, your fueling can get a little wonky just for a second. So that's really what the purpose of this table is. Now, you'll notice that the way Ford does this is they start with the highest number on top. And this is, you can tell by here, this is the highest number you can put in. You can't put in a true 16. 159375 is what you got. And you always need to make sure that you're working down from there. If you change the order of this table and put the big number on the bottom and work your way up to the smaller numbers, things don't work right. So you always have to respect the order in which these tables are designed when you're dealing with things like mass transfers or math transfers and these offset tables. So basically all we're doing here is, the highest number they give us is 15 volts, and they give us a 0.721. So we're going to go ahead and put that in for our top row. And then we're also going to put one in actually at 15 and copy that same thing. Now, another thing you'll notice, so like right now I put in 0.721, but when I arrow out of this, it's actually going to round this, and this has to do with the actual storage of this data. And so there's going to be little rounding things, and don't freak out over that. Just let it be. That's as close as you can get it. These are really minor differences, so just don't trip out too much about that. And really, we're just working our way through. So the next one is 0.801, and that's at 14 volts. Okay, and we've got 13, 12, 11, 10, 8, 6. So 12, 11, 10, 8, 6. And then when you don't have anything else, you basically just want to put zeros the rest of the way down. Okay, and then we go to the others. So back to 13, we have 0.903. At 12, we have 1.017. At 11, we have 1.142. 10, 1.288. 8, 1.777. And 6, we have 2.811. And again, at this point, and let's face it, if your car's only running at 6 volts voltage, something's really jacked up anyways. So don't really stress out about the fact that you don't have any more cells to work with and data going all the way down to 3 and 2 and 1 volts. Just whatever your bottom entry is in the data you have, just go ahead and let that be through the rest of the cells. And so looking at this, and the way you work in binary editor, when you're comparing this to another tune, and again, we're comparing this now to the A9L, you can see what your tune looks like, and that's the green value, and then the blue value is what you're comparing it to, which in this case was stock, and you can see there's a big difference here. So, this is another one of those things where you need the actual injector data for the injectors you're using. Don't just guess at this. And if you don't have it, again, sometimes you can't get your hands on it and you're going to work with the parts you have, that's okay, but just know there's extra hoops you're going to have to jump through to get that dialed in. We'll cover that in another video. Okay, so we've got the high slope, we've got the low slope, we've got the break point, and we've got this injector offset table. So that's the first really key things we have to do for fuel, just to kind of get this to function at all. Now, there's another thing that people don't realize about these sometimes, and that's that you have to go in and deal with your startup fueling. And what I mean by startup is when you're actually cranking the motor, you have some different fueling there. So to go into that, in this in fuel area, we also have a crank section. So opening that up, we have what's called the crank pulse width versus ECT. And so basically, while the car's operating, after you've started the car and the car's just running, it's making these fueling decisions on the injector pulse width based on reading your mass air meter and some other things in your oxygen sensors and whatnot, and figuring out how much fuel do we need. And the mass air meter is what's ultimately sort of controlling this thing and telling it how much fuel it's going to need to match the amount of air coming into the motor. But while the car is cranking until it fires off, the mass air meter is completely irrelevant. It is not looked at, it is not read, because until some stuff starts flowing through it, you can't get any good data. So while you're cranking the engine, the injector pulse width is hard-coded into the system with this table right here. And you'll notice that this is also based off of your engine coolant temp. So this is one of the first reasons why we say, you know, when your coolant temp sensor is not installed, or if it's failed, or there's a problem with it, it's not reading right, whatever it is, this is one of the main symptoms that you're going to notice. You may not be able to start the car under certain temperature conditions. And you'll notice that when it's really cold outside, so like -20 degrees, most of you probably are not driving your car there, but when you are, the injector pulse width, how long the injector is open every time it's squirting fuel, it's open a whole lot longer than it is when the car's up at full operating temperature and you're trying to start it. So like you run to the gas station, hop in, come back out to the car and crank it back up at full temp. It needs way, way less fuel. So the injector's only open 2 milliseconds up here. And it's kind of escalating as you get colder. So anytime you're having trouble starting the car and you're kind of working with a new combo and you're dealing with that startup fuel, what you really need to pay attention to is what's the coolant temp while you're trying to start it. And you need to decide, do I need to add or remove fuel at this position? Now, think about what we're doing here. We're starting with a factory Ford injector, and now we're going all the way to an 80 pound. So we have an injector that's like 4 times the size of what Ford put in here when they had these numbers. So the way you have to think about this is if I have an injector that for the same amount of time the injector is open, it's going to squirt out 4 times as much fuel, then theoretically I need to divide all of these numbers about by 4. And the way that I normally do this is I'll actually go into Excel and I'll create a spreadsheet for a minute. So I'm going to copy all of this stock data, and I'm going to go ahead and open up Excel and paste all that data in. And then there's 2 numbers that I want to plug in here, and this is going to be our high slopes for the original injectors Ford had and the high slopes for the new injectors that we're using. So going back in here, go back to that part of our area for a minute, 19.6417. So that was Ford's original injector size, and if these are accurate, this is where we're at right now. So basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this number, the new one, divided by that number, and I get 3.82. So basically what we're saying is if I take all of these pulse widths and divide them by 3.82, that should give me the same amount of fuel using the new injector. Now, that's not to mean that the new combo needs the same amount of fuel as a stock engine. In fact, it probably needs more because we're now, you know, we've got probably a bigger combo, we've got a blower on it, whatever else. So, you know, this is kind of a starting point, but expect that you're probably going to have to raise these numbers up some amount from there. So basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to say this cell equals that divided by this number right here. And then I'm just going to copy that math all the way down. And here's our new numbers. So now I can take all of that, go back to our cranking pulse width versus ECT, and dump in those numbers right here. And that's how we're going to determine our injector pulse width for cranking at these different areas. Now, again, this is a starting point, and depending on just how bulky your combo is, you'll probably need to raise these up. I mean, and just think about it for a minute. Do you think it takes the same amount of fuel to start up a bone stock 225 horsepower 302 from the 80s versus something like a, you know, a massive, you know, AFR 225 headed big block, you know, whatever combo? No, of course that big combo needs a lot more fuel all the time. So, you know, you're going to have to go up with this somewhat, and there's no right or wrong, but, you know, for a little, you know, mild combo here with a little blower, I might do something like multiply that by 1.25. So give it, like, take these numbers and give it about 25% more fuel, see how it does. And basically, I'm just going to pay attention, and I want to get the car at all these different operating temps if I can, and try to start the car at all of these areas once we get everything else in the combo sorted out, and see if I have a hard start condition. Now, talking about guys that don't tune this stuff at all, and, you know, a lot of guys will tell you, oh, well, you know, I ran a 30-pound injector, a 42-pound injector with a quote-unquote calibrated MAF, and I didn't do shit, and, you know, my stuff runs fine. Well, maybe, you know, maybe they got lucky. Theoretically it can, and, you know, with again, the quote unquote calibrated MAF, you know, maybe that works okay when the car's running and it, you know, nothing's choking out too much, but again, that MAF isn't considered. And now you've got this massive injector that's way bigger than what was in their factory, and you're just flooding all this extra fuel in. And when the car's cold and you need a bunch of extra fuel anyways, it's probably going to fire off okay. But in that condition with no tune, as you get into these higher operating temps, this is where guys are cranking. They can't get it to fire off. That's probably why. They're probably flooding their engine. This is why. And one of the ways you combat that is if you push the pedal all the way to the floor while you're cranking the engine, that actually cuts all the fuel. It's kind of a little trick. So sometimes, you know, if you pedal it a little bit, you still have fuel, but if you put it all the way to the floor, it cuts fuel. So if you think it's starting to flood and you can't get it to catch and you're playing that whole game, you know, you might be able to cut the fuel for a second with your foot, come back out of it, maybe get it to catch. But again, this is why we're tuning the car. We don't want to play games like that. Nobody wants to get stuck, you know, when they're out running errands or at the racetrack trying to go through the pits or whatever. So, okay, so this is kind of the cranking fuel. So now we've got all of our injector data loaded in. Theoretically, the car's going to crank and we should get past that. Now, the next thing that I want to show you is, this is kind of a weird thing Ford does, because, you know, you would think the fuel's already dialed in with a bunch of other settings, but they also have this table right here, wide open throttle multiplier versus RPM. So they're taking whatever your normal air to fuel is that you're requesting, and they're jacking with it here anyways. I don't know why they do this. We're going to handle that elegantly elsewhere. So I would always recommend in every tune, in all circumstances, except there's one caveat. This is how you deal with running a dry nitrous shot, where your nitrous kit doesn't come with you know, fuel coming in elsewhere, and you're actually having to tune to make the extra fuel it needs to come through the injector. This is how you can do that. You can mess with this table. We'll do this in another video, and this is how you can get to tune that stuff. But any other combo, turbo, supercharged, naturally aspirated, or your nitrous that's a wet kit and the fuel's already handled, just put these all as one so this isn't jacking with you. This is a pretty important thing. So that's kind of on every tune. Now, the last part of the fuel that we're really going to focus on right now is down here in this open closed loop table. Now, there's kind of two things happening here. So this base open loop table, this is a table where you're looking at different operating temperatures, and this is your coolant temp sensor we're talking about. So from -30 Fahrenheit up to 240, and different load measurements. Now, this is actually a special load, and I've got a chart that I'm going to pull up to talk about this and why I started this video talking about how you want to get your combo together first, or if nothing else, take the belt off the blower and go make some passes with it to understand a very specific number. This is called per load. So you notice that this doesn't say just load right here. This says load % or per load. So what this is you could think of it this way. If you've got some other settings dialed in that we're going to show you in a minute, you basically mapped out and said that if you're at wide open throttle at all RPMs and you're kind of watching what load your engine is capable of achieving at different RPMs, you're going to plug that into a table. And if you've done that right, naturally aspirated, your per load should stay almost at exactly 100 all the way through the power curve. If you've got that dialed in. If you don't have that dialed in, then it's going to be a little weird. So before we tune this table, I want to show you what that stuff looks like. So if we go up into this air category and we open up this air load, there's this load scaling at sea level versus RPM, and there's a table right here. So basically what this is saying, again, if you're at full throttle at 1,000 RPMs, this is the maximum load that your engine is capable of getting to. And then at this RPM, this is your maximum. And again, like we talked in the last video, wherever your peak torque is, that's basically where this load is going to top out, and then it's going to start to go back down the other way. So this curve right here generally is following your torque curve. If you go throw your stuff on a dyno and actually see where it is, you'll notice the load kind of follows it. So the way that you would do this normally is you would go try to make a pass, again, naturally aspirated, take the blower belt off or do all this before you even put the blower on the car. Make sure that you're logging your RPMs and your load at a bare minimum. And you want to get in here and look at this. So this is actually an old dyno run I did with this little 347 combo a while back. And it wasn't super dialed in for this one setting, but it's pretty close. So what I'm looking at here is, first of all, my throttle position sensor. So you can see they basically loaded it on the dyno. They pulled it through a few gears, and this is where they leaned into it. So this yellow line right here, this flat line, this is my wide open throttle, and then they got back out of it right there. Okay, this yellow line right here, load, this is the actual load that the engine was reading. We're going to zoom in and look at this. Now, granted, you know, when you're on a dyno, you're not going to step on it at like 1,000 RPMs. I mean, you're probably going to pull it up to about 2,500 to 3,500 and then lay into it from there. So in this case, you can see my RPMs right at this point. We're at about 3,250, 3,300, and that's the point where they leaned into it. And then they got out just a little bit before $6,000. So, you know, that's fine. But what you notice is that, again, my load measurement, and I'll go back to here so it's highlighted yellow, you notice that it was climbing through the RPM curve, and it peaked out about here. And in this case, that was about 4,500 RPMs. And then the load starts to go back down actually pretty rapidly. And by the time we got up to $6,000 or close to it, you know, the load is way down. I mean, the load is all the way down to 68. So the way I always dial that one table in that we were just looking at is I want to go from as low as RPMs as I'm comfortable with, you know, probably not 1,000, but maybe like 1,500 or 1,700. Lay into it full throttle and ride it out all the way to red line. Again, assuming there's no other problems or concerns with doing it. You ride it all the way out, you take this log, and you figure out where's that peak point. So in this case right here, it looks like I'm going to hit about 84 load at 4464 RPMs. So I'm definitely going to put a number in here, 4464, and that load number was about 84. So that's going to be my first point that I'm going to put in here. Now, I need it to fall off after that, and I need to do something leading up to it. So I'm going to go see what other measurements I have, and you're really looking for the curve. So what I see here is that it looks like it goes down a little bit to about here, and then it's almost a straight line down. So this might be another good point to put in on this map. Where's this at? About 4850 RPMs. So we could throw in 4850, and the load there was about 82 load. So I'll put that in. I'm going to move these two cells down so I can get another one up here. And then we're going to go to about where red line was, which, so we'll do that at about $6,000. So just kind of sliding this over. Looks like it's about right there. And we're at about 71.5 load at 6,000. So 6,000, 71.5. So now you can see this curve is starting to look like the curve we had when we were on it. And then we noticed that things were dropping down. So at this point, we're at about 80.5 load at 3,500 RPMs. And then, you know, had I had a better pool to look at, I could probably get some lower data in here. I don't have that, so we're just going to, this is close enough for now. And honestly, it's really not going to be the end of the world down here, so you can probably leave these bottom rows okay. And then up here, we definitely need to drop this back down. Now, I always recommend leaving this top row at the maximum RPM, but what you could do is drop that all the way down to 1. And I know this curve looks crazy, but realistically, if you're following along with this map, so there's 6,000 RPMs. Even if I take it all the way up to, you know, say 7,000, which I wouldn't do on this combo, and you look at the cross section, look at the bottom right, we're actually down at 65 low. So it's not like it just fell off the map. It's actually a pretty straight curve going down. So you can actually do stuff like this and it'll go okay, because realistically, you're never going to get down into, you know, these ranges here. We're not running 9,000 or 10,000 RPMs. So this is how you get this set up. And again, this is supposed to represent the maximum load you achieve at various RPMs at wide open throttle, naturally aspirated. If that's dialed in, then when you go log this again, what you're going to notice is the LoadX or the Perload. When you look at the log, Perload shows up as LoadX. You notice how this is pretty flat. Even though my load curve goes up and way back down, the Perload stays almost flat. And if you look at it down here, this LoadX, we're at 97. This should stay right around 100 all the time through that entire curve. Now it's a little off here. It's not perfect. It's, you know, 93, 94, 97, 98. It's a little low down in this bottom area. So this is obviously where this curve wasn't really dialed in, but it's pretty close. But now that that's pretty close, you know, at wide open throttle, you have a row in your fueling table that is going to stay real close to 100. So now we go back and look at your base fuel table, and this is 90 per load. So that's basically pretty accurate. We're going to be right up in here at wide open throttle. And you notice that these are the air to fuel ratios that the computer is requesting at, again, a specific operating temperature, coolant, and your load. And so really, I mean, you should never be beating on your car when it's less than operating temperature. You just shouldn't do it. So really, you're focused on these two and perhaps maybe this cell. These are really your three temperature areas for performance tuning that you're trying to dial in. And of course, you need the higher areas. Now, the first thing I'll tell you is this factory stuff, man, this is too rich. I mean, for a naturally aspirated combo, you know, this is real conservative stuff. So this is one of the areas, even in a naturally aspirated combo, you can get some power by leaning this out a little bit. So generally, you know, you go more into the high 12s at wide open throttle, it's going to be a little bit smoother for you there. So, you know, that's a pretty good thing to do. But when you're in boost, you have higher combustion temperatures, you got a lot more pressure in the cylinder. So you generally are going to run a lot richer than that once you get into boost. And at peak boost, you know, a really good baseline that I've always used on pretty much every combo is about 11.5 or 11.6 to 1. That's pretty damn safe for almost every combo. If you're doing something really radical, then again, you're probably past the limits of this thing anyways. But any reasonable boosted turbo or you know, blower combo on a small block Ford, go run 11.5, 11.6 as a starting point. That's good. You might be able to run it a little bit leaner than that, and it's going to depend too on, you know, what heads you have in the cam and some other stuff. You might get up towards 12, but you definitely don't want to go run high 12s or low 13s there to fuel at wide open throttle with boost. So what we know is this. The first thing we know is that when we get into boost, we're going to hit way more than 100 per load because that's what we hit naturally aspirated, and it's going to go up from there. So the first thing we need to do is rescale this table so that these rows don't just stop at 90, and we want them to go all the way up, potentially as high as 200, so we have a lot of room to work with. Temperature's fine on the other side. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to use Excel as a tool again. This is important. So I'm going to start by copying all of this data, and we'll just start a new sheet here. I'm going to throw that data in there, and I'm also going to make myself a note of what these numbers are: 90, 80, 70, 55, 40, 27.5, 15, and 7.5. So that's what we have on that axis. And then across the top, we have -30 up to 240 in increments of 30 degrees. So -30, 0, 30, 60, 90, 120, 150, 180, 210, and 240. Okay, so that's my temperature. So that's what stock looks like. So we're just going to kind of set that aside for now. Now, when I'm trying to set these up, this is one of those limitations of the EEC we talked about in the last video. I can't magically make more rows than this. So right now, you know, Ford is giving us 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 rows to work with. That's what I have to work with. I can change what these rows are, but you got 8. Now, you're really not going to be ever doing anything where you're all the way down here at 7.5. So in my mind, this is a row that can just disappear. You're not really losing anything. Man, same for this row too. You know, this is usually something I would kill, and I'll start with this row here, this 27.5, and that'll kind of be my bottom row, or maybe put something in at like 20, and then kind of work my way up. Now, when you're new to tuning, one of the things you want to do is try to set the scale in a way where you can at least try to make some use of the data that's there. So like having a row at 40, 55, 70, 80, you know, some of these areas, this will be helpful for you because you can copy essentially that entire row and end up with something similar to what Ford had. So I'm going to think about some different possibilities. What we know on the new one is that we're going to try to go all the way up to 200. So we're kind of reserving that down here. And, you know, I'm probably going to want some amount of adjustability here. So, you know, what I might do is like 166, 133, and 100. So this is kind of the new areas of the table I'm going to build. And then I have 4 more to work with. So what I might do from here is, you know, use this 80 row. That's probably a pretty good one to keep. We can do a 55 row. We can do a 40 row. And then maybe what I'll do is split the difference on these two, you know, and do something like a 20 row. That might not be too bad. So that's maybe what I'm shooting for there. And then my temperatures, there's really no reason to change that across the other axis. So that looks pretty good. Now what I'm going to do is copy Ford's entire 80 row here to my 80 row here. I'm going to copy their 55 row to my 55 row. I copy their 40 row to my 40 row. And then 20 is not exactly between the middle of these. So if you want to, you know, really get in the middle, we'll go to like 22. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to average out each of these 2 cells across just to show you where that falls. But then I'm going to actually make one more adjustment from there. So I'm going to say this one equals the average of these two cells. And then I'm going to just copy that across, and that's what we end up with. So this is kind of the new bottom end of this table, and now I have extra rows to work with up here. Now, what I can tell you is when you're in full boost again, what we're looking for is probably around 11.6. So I'm going to go ahead and copy that here. And honestly, just because I'm saying full boost, you know, depending on your combo, you probably won't get all the way up to 200. This is really here for safety more than anything else. So I'm going to go ahead and copy that into all these because this is really any amount of boost. Now, this is really conservative. And, you know, when you're only down at 100, this is actually probably a little too conservative. And you kind of want to ease into it. You know, full boost, you probably need to be at 11.6. But when you're only at like 1 or 2 pounds of boost, you're barely pushing it harder than naturally aspirated anyways. And we've already said that even the factory's 12.3 or 12.5 is a little conservative. So what I'm going to do here is, in my opinion, a nice, safe, naturally aspirated is 12.8. So I'm going to throw that here for these 3 rows, or for these 3 cells. And then up in this 100 right here, I'm going to go kind of in between. We're going to do something like, let's do like a 12.2 right here. And again, this is actually still pretty conservative. You probably lean this out a little bit more, but this is pretty good. And then I might do something like an 11.8 right here. And depending on how much boost you have, that's going to determine if you actually even get up into these areas. You may, you know, especially if you've got a little pulley on it, you're going to go try to run, you know, 12 or 13 pounds, you'll likely be up in here. But this is probably a pretty safe starting point. Now, going back to the factory stuff for a minute, you know, you can see that basically what Ford's doing is this is your air to fuel ratio. So as this number is going down, you're richer. As it's going up, you're leaner. And you can see it as the operating temperature is colder, Ford is requesting more fuel. They're trying to make things run richer and richer because the engines actually need more fuel to be happy and not cause you a lot of issues. So they're definitely going to run things a little richer here. So what I would generally do is I would figure out in Ford's calibration, what's the difference from 150, which is kind of the last cell before we start having gaps. What's the difference from that to that? And I'm going to simulate these same differences here. So what I'm going to do real quick is I'm going to make a little cheat that says this equals the difference from that cell to that cell. And then we'll copy this over, and we can see how much it's changing as they go from one to the other, and then we can sort of simulate that same type of thing. So starting from here, I know that I need to subtract that amount to produce this cell. So this cell equals my 11.6 minus 0.344. We get to that. And then this cell equals that minus 343. And you know, this isn't perfect, but you're kind of copying what Ford did and getting something relatively close. Now, in all fairness, Ford had some compromises in here too. This isn't perfect, so don't think that I'm suggesting it is, but it definitely gives you a starting point to work with here. So, you know, we're just kind of working through here. And then you see these weird anomalies sometimes. Like this has a huge drop off right here, and I don't think that's particularly necessary. So I'm actually going to cap this at 9.6 where Ford had it. And I'm going to say this is the average between that cell and this cell here. So we'll just type that in. That's about 10.1. So that gets us pretty close. Now, because we're looking for 11.6 here also, these exact same values will apply here. So I'm going to copy all of that, and we're going to paste in just those values so we have an exact copy. And then basically my difference from here to here is 0.2. So I'm just going to say this equals that cell plus 0.2. Copy that all the way across. And this equals that cell. Equals that cell plus another 0.4. Copy that across, and ta-da, we have a fuel table. So this is a good starting point for that table. Now, in order for me to plug this in, though, we still have to solve this problem. We have to rescale this so I even have these values up here. And this is kind of tricky the first time you do it, just to understand what you're working with. So let me show you where that is. So when you want to change any of these tables that it'll allow you to rescale, you're actually doing that down here in the system area. And under system scaling, you've got some different things that you can change. And what we're dealing with here, this is going to be our fuel tables per load, which is this guy right here. This is what you're changing. So basically what they're doing is they're saying the bottom row in that table, so row 0, they're saying at row 0, I want to have 7.5, right? So that's your row 0, and then row 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. So they're saying at row 0, I want 7.5. I know that I want 22. So I'm going to change that number to 22. Okay. And then the next one up is going to be 40. So at row 1, I want 40. Okay. And then sometimes you can skip, like I could go right from row 1 to 3 and put in a number here, but what it's going to do is it'll average out the things in between. So that's how I can go from all the way from 100 to 200 by adding just 2 values in here, because the gap from here to here, here to here, and here to here, it's just jumping up by 33 every time. So what we're going to do here is I'm going to go ahead and plug in the 55 and the 80. So 55 and 80. And 55 is what's coming in at row 2, 80's at row 3, and then we put in row 100 right here, starting at 4. And because I didn't put anything else here, and the next entry up is 200 at row 7, that's going to average out rows 5, 6, and 7 to basically fill in the blank. So if I go back and look at this table now, check it out. It looks like I wanted row 0's at 22, and then we're working up from there. So 22, 40, 55, 80, and then 100, 133, 166, and 200. So now this is scaled the way that I want it to. Now, before I just go ahead and plug in all these numbers here, I want you to read the descriptions. And this is really important when you're working with these calibrations, that you pay attention to what it's telling you. I learned a whole lot about tuning these by just reading these damn descriptions of these properties we're changing. So going back to the per load, you notice what it says. It says this table right here gets used by these 2 tables, 1307 and 1328. So what you can do here, you can hit this find button in the top and you can just type in something like 1328. You can also get to that if you just hit on your keyboard Control F as in find, you know, it'll pop up that dialog. When we type in 1328, you can see what that is. And then of course 1307 was the actual base table we just changed. So we already know that that's scaled the way we want. We understand the sort of the changes that we're going to have to deal with. But 1328, we need to go look at that and see, well, what is this? Now, MFA, for this table, the first thing you can just notice is it's already been rescaled here. But if you just look at the values here, every single cell in this is all set to 2. And this is one of those types of tables that, I mean, you can read the description of what this actually is, but this is not the kind of table that you have to stress about. Now, when we get into the Spark stuff in another video, there's a lot of changes we're going to have to make to a lot of tables to make things run the right way with our adaptive learning and everything else, just because we want to have better control over our Spark. So that one's a lot more dangerous if you're not careful. And this is something I see other tuners do a lot. They get lazy and they skip or forget some of those things or don't know to do it. And it's not good for your adaptive learning and a few other areas. So when we're working right here, this is something I'm not going to stress about. I'm going to leave all these at 2, and the fact that I rescaled it doesn't matter. Everything's going to run fine. And because those are the only 2 things this is telling me are affected by this change, then really all I need to do is just focus on this 1307 and get our open loop tuned back up. So we've got the cells we want here, or the scaling. The scaling here we didn't change. So now I can take all my numbers, and you can just paste that in, and you've got your table in here. Now, I like to make a few other changes. So we're pretty close now, but there's a couple other changes. So when I'm up at operating temperature at these lowest load, Ford richens this stuff up a hair. And I like to just keep this at a flat 14.64, which is your stoke when you're dealing with normal pump gas without ethanol. Now, I'm also a big fan of not using any ethanol in these old cars, unless, of course, you've like done your entire fuel system and you change all the lines and you're planning to run E85 or even just something with like 10 or 15 or 20% ethanol in it. But you know, when you're dealing with pump gas, I'd recommend that on these cars if it's just a little bolt-on thing. You want to be at 14.6. So I'm going to go ahead and plug these numbers in for all of these cells down here, starting at 150, and then I'll leave the rest of it alone from there. I'm also going to plug that number in for this one cell. So now what we're saying is we have a nice, stable, requested fuel. For a lot of our basic driving, you know, when you're just putting around town, you're really not leaning into it. Most of what you do is going to be in this range here. And then when you get up here, it is going to start to, this is when you're starting to lean in the pedal a little bit. You're not really in boost yet, but you're definitely leaning in. We could probably even make this a little bit richer here because this is not quite wide open throttle naturally aspirated, but it's close. So we could even probably put this up a hair higher, and then we can maybe make some fine-tune adjustments later. So I'm going to bring that up just a hair. I'm going to do the same thing here. We'll maybe bring this up to like, let's go to 12.5. That's pretty safe here. And then as we get into boost, you know, then we're really going to need to bring things back down to stay safe up here. So this is the first thing we've done. We've scaled our load. We've got a nice fuel table in here. This ought to be, you know, pretty decent as a starting point. It's a little conservative in some areas in this mid-range. You may be able to do more with it, but you know, I don't like to blow cars up, so this is a good starting point for you. So just to kind of recap, this is about the end of this video, but to recap what we did, we started with your injectors. We got your high slope and your low slope plugged in. We got your brake point plugged in, and we got your voltage offset table put in here. Then we went in and we changed your cranking pulse width versus ECT, and we ran the math to figure out how much bigger of an injector did we have versus what Ford had in it. And then we gave it a little extra sauce on top just because the combo is a little bit more built. So that's kind of the basics. Then we know that because we're dealing with boost, if we run Ford's air to fuel ratios up top, we're going to blow shit up. We don't want to do that. So we've gone in here, scaled up the table so that when we're in boost, we've got something reasonable. We've tuned up the mid-range just a hair, and we normalize things a little bit to make it easier to look at down here. Lastly, with this wide open throttle multiplier, we got that out of our way. We just set those to all one, so this isn't going to be jacking with us the whole time. That's probably a pretty good idea. And then there's one more table that sneaks by in a lot of tunes, and it's kind of similar to this. This is only in effect during wide open throttle, but there's also this little guy right here. Now, to be honest with you, you know, this drove me nuts. I didn't know about this for a while, and I had a lot of problems on a buddy's car trying to figure out why it was running so rich once the seasons changed and it got colder. You know, we're four-season kind of guys, and we like to drive our stuff year-round. And Oklahoma, you know, we get down in the 20s and 30s quite a bit, and sometimes a little colder than that. So, you know, sometimes you tune the car spring and summer, things are going great, temperature drops, it starts running like shit, and you're, you know, dealing with some new issues, and that's fine. But this is another one of those things that you have to be careful of. So what this is doing is this is actually multiplying 1307. 1307 is the fuel table we just set up. So if this is what our fueling is normally going to do, but then there's a multiplier that's going to multiply, essentially lowering these values when the engine's cold, even though this entire table is based on temperature anyway. So it's just crazy that Ford did it this way. But yeah, you know, things are going to run pretty rich. Now, keep in mind, though, this table is based on air temp, whereas our base fuel table is based on coolant temp. And this is another one of those things that kind of prompted me to start getting into these videos to begin with. Guys talking about relocating their air charge temperature sensor out of the intake manifold and moving it over to their cold air intake. This is one of the reasons that's a big no-no. I'm going to make a whole video about other reasons why not to do this, but check it out right here, man. You go into the cold months of the year and you've got that thing relocated off the manifold and over in the cold air intake. You may never actually even get to 76 degrees on this sensor. The engine could be full temp, man. You could be running at 200 on the engine, but this sensor may never even get that. And what that means is you're running rich all the damn time, by as much as like 20% if that sensor's at 0, and even richer if it's colder than that. So this is another one of those things that, you know, as long as you leave the air temp sensor where it is from the factory, and a lot of you aren't driving your cars when it's cold anyways, you might be okay leaving this table alone. Or if you really dial in and pay attention to the fueling going on in these colder temperature ranges and adjust this appropriately, then one of the things you might consider doing is going ahead and bringing this value up to a 1 also, and then give it that extra enrichment in the base table itself if that's what you really think you need to do. And, you know, the only way you're going to figure out if you need to do that is by doing some testing, see how the car responds. So this is, you know, this is your fuel setup. This is the first part of your tune. So we're going to call it right here. The next video that I'm going to make here in the next couple days, we're going to focus on getting your mass air transfer dumped in. I know I said I was going to do it in this video, but we'll do it another day. Making a few other adjustments, and then we're going to focus on spark, which is the other big part of the tune. And then the rest of the stuff is kind of just basic things I would do on any tune. And I want to cover that too, because that's important, you know, things like whether or not you have AC, whether or not you have power steering, what your fan control looks like. You know, there's just little things here and there, emissions, you know, that we want to consider. So be looking for that in another video. Appreciate you guys dropping in, and this is just the beginning of the boost tune. So appreciate it. Take care, guys.